Alrighty.
Okay, maybe we'll start. I know there's some people, it's live streamed to YouTube, so there are some people watching also there. So I'm very pleased and grateful and excited to welcome Dr. Yael Ziegler to the Hamayan Shiur group. Yael taught me for 2 years in Matan and a little bit on Tehillim outside of Matan. I'm really have enjoyed everything that I've read and heard from you since, and my children know the sound of your voice from Shiurim in the car and in the kitchen, but they don't really know. One day they'll know you again. Where's the thing? So Dr. Yael Ziegler is a senior lecturer at in Tanakh at Herzog College and the director of Matan in Yerushalayim. She received her BA from Stern College and MA and PhD at Bar-Ilan University. Dr. Ziegler has lectured widely on various Tanakh topics in Israel, United States, South Africa, Australia, and Europe. Dr. Ziegler is the author of Promises to Keep, the Oath in Biblical Narrative. This is this book here. That's not this book here, but this is Ruth, From Alienation to Monarchy, which has also been published in Hebrew. And also this book, which I just had to pull out of my luggage because I took it with me to the Rebbitzins retreat. This is was available only just last year and newly in Melbourne. Lamentations, Faith in a Turbulent World, in the Maggid series. So she lives in Alon Shvut in Israel with her husband and her 5 children. I'm very excited to have you here with us.
Thank you, Libby. Okay, I'm excited to be here as well. And what did I do? Okay, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint, and I'm just going to start by dedicating this shiur in memory of my mother. I have Yahrzeit today, actually, and it's been 17 years. So I'm very honored to be bringing Torah to Australia in her memory. Okay, so I wanted to talk about Eicha. As Liddy mentioned, I recently came out with a book on Eicha. It recently came out. I've been working on it for, many, many years. So, it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Megilat Eicha. It's not an easy book. It's not an easy book for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's not an easy book because of the content, right? Just the substance of the book. The book is a book of lamentations. It's a book that is using poetry to convey emotions, right? And the emotions are difficult emotions. They're emotions that particularly surround the events of the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE. That is the first temple, the first Beit HaMikdash, the fall of Yerushalayim, the destruction of the Davidic dynasty, the subsequent exile, and of course, all of the terrible events that lead up to that, including the siege on Yerushalayim, the terrible famine in the city, the terrible, I think, images of death and destruction that attend all of these events. So that makes it a very difficult book. It's a difficult book to absorb. It's a difficult book to read. It's a difficult book to explain. And yet it's, in my mind, one of the reasons that I devoted so many years to it is because it's a very important book. It's an important book because it gives us the tools to cope with suffering, to cope with difficulties, right? It gives us tools to be human in these events, but at the same time to experience them within a theological context. And that for me, I think, is what makes the book of Eicha such a useful and important book. I will say one other thing, and that is that this book is really very difficult, not just because of the content of the book, but also because of the poetry of the book. It's very difficult Hebrew, right? Even for those people who are quite fluent in Hebrew, even for your average Israeli, the book of Eicha is not a very accessible book. It's the same as, like, I don't know, if we're trying to read Shakespeare or, Chaucerian English, right? It's a hard book. It's a hard book to access. It's a hard book to understand. So what I want to talk about today is the goal of writing this book of Lamentations in poetry. I really want to talk about poetry. I want to talk about biblical poetry in particular. I want to talk about the poetry of Lamentations specifically. And I want to talk about how technique is used to convey meaning. Again, we're not just talking about general poetry, we're talking about biblical poetry, and therefore we're not just talking about regular meaning, we're talking about religious meaning, right? So, what I want to do is to take some of the features, some of the poetic features that we find in this book and show how these features are used in order to express the ideas that the book is trying to express. So what I want to do is I want to begin with some kind of general features, and then I want to turn our attention to the structure of the book and how the structure of the book of Eicha is used to convey some of Eicha's most basic, most important ideas, such that I think that for those people who are familiar with the book of Eicha, but are not necessarily familiar with the structure of the book, I think I would go so far as to say that you're going to be missing the very essence of the book. Right? I think that really some of the most critical ideas, the most vital ideas in the book rest in some of these techniques that are used, some of the, I would say, the dry technicalities of the book. Without understanding them, we can't really understand the really deep and profound messages of the book. So that's pretty much what I want to try to show you. In order to do this, we're going to be kind of skipping around in the book. I think that that's okay, particularly in the book of Eicha, because of course the book of Eicha, it's not a story, it's not prose, it's poetry, and therefore, we can skip around in the book. But when we get to the end of the shiur, I do want to give you kind of a bird's eye view of the book and how I view the general book as a book of theology. Now, that having been said, of course, it's not a book of theology, right? If you're looking for a book of theology, you have to turn to Iyov, to the book of Job. You can turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Kohelet, right? The book of Eicha is not a book of theology per se. It's a book of emotions. But of course, underlying these emotions, we have a kind of a theological approach, or I would rather say several theological approaches that cohere together to form one composite picture. Okay, so that's what we'll be talking about as we get to the end of our shiur. But I want to start with something that seems a little bit technical, and that is the meter of biblical poetry and the meter of Lamentations in particular, the meter of the book. Now, I don't know about you, but I mean, I assume many of you here have taken a class in poetry sometime in your life. And I don't know what people think when they hear the words meter. I assume some people give a big yawn and other people think, wow, that's the most fascinating thing I've ever encountered. But, I will say something about meter in general, and that is that we're all influenced by meter, right? In other words, we don't really know how influenced we are by meter because we don't notice it, right? But meter, of course, is the kind of the rhythm of the sentence. When I'm speaking, I'm using a certain meter, a certain cadence to my speech, and it's meter is really about stressed syllables and the way that stressed syllables appear in our speech. Now, as I said, you don't necessarily notice how influenced you are by meter, but I can certainly tell you that if I were to use the wrong meter, it would be very annoying, right? You follow that, right? You would notice if I were not using the meter that we're accustomed to. And by the way, I will say that as someone who made Aliyah to Israel, well, it's already been 30 years, but at some point made Aliyah to Israel, oftentimes when I'd be speaking, I could sense in the room that I was saying something wrong, and I'm checking my vocabulary, and I'm realizing that it's not in my vocabulary, but it's in my pronunciation. It's in the syllable that I'm stressing wrong. And we all do this, right? Certainly many of us, English speakers, when we come to Israel, we stress the wrong syllables, and that becomes very annoying, as I said. Okay, so biblical meter. When we talk about biblical poetry is usually one sentence, which is a binary sentence, meaning it's divided into two parts, and the two parts of the sentence have even meter. It creates a very nice kind of balanced feeling. I'll give you an example from Shirat Ha'azinu, from Devarim, chapter 32. Listen to the words. Ha'azinu, listen to the stressed syllables. Ha'azinu, Hashamayim, Ve'adabeira, Ve'tishma, Ha'aretz, Imrefi. Okay, it's not the amount of words, it's the amount of stress syllables. There are 3 stress syllables in the first part of the sentence and 3 in the second part of the sentence. And this is very usual for biblical poetry. It is not the case in lamentation poetry. Already 150 years ago, biblical scholars paid attention to the fact that in Megilat Eicha, much of the poetry, not all of the poetry, but much of the poetry is written in something which they termed Lamentations meter. What is Lamentations meter? Lamentations meter, and I'm bringing you an example from the book of Amos, because Amos introduces this next pasuk saying, I am saying a kina over you, a kina over you. I am saying a dirge over you. And what is this dirge? Look at these words that I brought for you on the screen. Nafla, lo tosif, kum, bitulat, Yisrael. I'm not even going to translate the words. What I want you to pay attention to is the meter. The first part of the sentence has 3 stressed syllables. The second part of the sentence has only 2. And it creates kind of a feeling that we're listening to someone crying. We're listening to someone who can't finish their sentence. It conveys fatigue, exhaustion, sadness, a choked up kind of feeling. He can't finish his sentence. I am straining to hear the end of the second sentence, which never comes. This is the kind of meter that we have quite a lot of in Megilat Eicha, and I want to show you an example. But the example that I'm bringing for you is an example which I'm specifically bringing because I think it has theological meaning. The example that I'm bringing for you is from Perek Aleph, from the first chapter in the book of Eicha. And this pasuk, this verse, has 3 sentences, each of which are binary sentences divided into 2, each of which I want to examine the meter, okay? So this is the 5th pasuk in the first chapter. Listen to the words. Hayu sareha lirosh, oiveha shalu. Okay, now I, as the biblical listener, am straining to hear the last syllable, and it doesn't come. Hayu sareha lirosh, her enemies were at the head. Oiveha shalu, her foes were tranquil. This is a description of Rasha Vatovlo, the evil people who prevailed, the evil people who did well. No wonder it's an imbalanced verse. It's an imbalanced verse because it conveys a certain imbalance in the world, a certain lack of harmony. This is not a balanced verse. Now I want to skip to the 3rd sentence in this verse. Look at the 3rd sentence in this verse. Oleleha halchu shvi lifnei tsar. It's an even more imbalanced sentence. There are 3 stressed syllables in the first part of the sentence. Her children went into captivity before the enemy. Okay, again, an imbalanced verse. This time, the verse is showing us about tzaddik varalo, good people, children, innocent people, that bad things happen to them. This verse, as you can see, is looking around Yerushalayim and noting the divine injustice. It's noting the imbalance, the lack of harmony in the world. And it's a troubled pasuk. And therefore the pasuk, the meter of the pasuk, reflects the sense of imbalance. But what I think is really remarkable is the middle sentence. All around us, we have injustice. all around us, we have lack of harmony. But what do we have right here in the middle? This is the first time in the book of Eicha that God appears. And it is a balanced sentence. Ki Hashem hoga al rov psha'eha. For God made her moan due to her great sins. There's the balance, okay? What this pasuk conveys, I mean, just through its meter is, I think, such a profound idea that even though the world around us seemed to swirl with injustice, with lack of balance, with lack of harmony, and therefore, when the narrator is describing this world, he can't even finish his sentence. He is choking back his sobs as he looks at this world that makes no sense. But the middle, the center of the world, the narrator recognizes there is justice there. There must be justice there because God is there and is meting out justice according to the proportion of the people's sins. It's, I think, really an extraordinary example. There are other examples like this, but the reason I brought this example is because I think it's the best example that shows how meter reflects idea, how technique conveys meaning, okay? So that's pretty much the kind of thing that I want to start to show you. I'm just going to bring you, examples of different kinds of poetic techniques and how they're used to convey meaning. I want to turn our attention to a more obvious technique, one that is more obviously meaningful. And that is, there's a lot of argument as to what ultimately constitutes poetry, right? Scholars of literature, not just of Tanakh, but scholars of literature often argue what makes poetry? And there's a lot of discourse about this. And I think one thing about which there is a large measure of agreement is that there is a high degree of imagery in poetry, right? Because what is imagery actually, right? When I use an image, I'm trying to get my reader to feel what I'm feeling. Poetry is there in order not just to convey my experience, but to cause the reader to have an experience, an emotional experience of their own as they're reading. Now, of course, Megilat Eicha, it's about grief, it's about sadness, it's about suffering, and we read it every year on Tisha B'Av in order to somehow plug into this experience of grief over the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. That's a hard thing to experience, thousands of years later. And so all of these techniques are being used in order to try to get our listeners, those people who are listening to the poetry of Eicha, to have an active emotional experience. And one of the best ways to do this is to use imagery, because imagery, of course, makes the person start imagining things. So here's one example. Okay, when we're reading chapter 3 in Eicha, we read the experience of the Gever. Ani hagever ra'a oni b'shevet evrato. I am the man who has seen my affliction, and he describes his affliction at the hand of God. He is very much having a religious crisis, right? In chapter 3, the Gever, the man, is describing his own personal suffering at the hand of God. And look at how he describes God. It is so bold as to almost be blasphemous, okay? Look in Perek Gimmel, Pasuk Yud, chapter 3, verse 10, Dov orev hu li ari b'mistarim. God is a bear lying in ambush for me. He is a lion in hiding. This is an extraordinary imagery that is used for God. It conveys an image of God who is predatory and arbitrary, right? It's an extraordinary kind of, I would say, almost anti-theological experience. I mean, it's theological in that he's contending with God, but it's almost blasphemous in terms of what it's saying about this person's experience of God. This person is so deeply confused by what God has done to him that he describes God as a wild animal, arbitrary and predatory in his attack on this person. And it conveys, I think, an extraordinary frame of mind of the Gever in chapter 3, who indeed is experiencing a sense of alienation from God within the context of his suffering, which, by the way, I think is also a very important insight that we get in the book of Eicha. What we see in the book of Eicha is that the person who is describing his suffering is describing himself as feeling alienated from God. That is, I think, very much a reflection of the human condition. Sometimes human beings in their suffering feel alienated from God. And Eicha says that's reasonable. You don't want to get stuck there. You want to continue in your exploration of your relationship with God, but that initial experience is very much part of the experience of suffering. I want to mention another imagery that is used in Eicha. The narrator turns to Yerushalayim at one point and says to Yerushalayim, "What can I compare you to, Yerushalayim, to console you? Ki gadol kayam shivrech mi yirpalach. As great as the sea is your brokenness, who can possibly heal you?" Right? I think it's an extraordinary metaphor. As great as the sea is your brokenness. It conveys so much in just one word, aside from being a wordplay, right? Shivrech means brokenness, but shivrech also means the breakers of the sea, which is a wordplay both in Hebrew and in English. Mishbireyam, the breakers of the sea. Your brokenness are like those waves that break against the beach, against the shore. But what is this really conveying? Of course, it is conveying the enormity of Yerushalayim's pain. Yerushalayim's pain is like the sea. It is unbridgeable. You can't throw an anchor in it. The depths are unknown. You are left tossing on the roiling, stormy, tempestuous waves, which are chaotic, which rise and fall, and which is salty water, like the tears of Yerushalayim. It's just an amazing piece of imagery because in one word, we've conveyed so much. Okay, so that's the way that imagery comes into play in Eicha. We won't talk about this. Yerushalayim is also a personified woman. I'm not going to talk about that for now. I want to talk about another technique that is often used in poetry in general, in Eicha in particular. And by the way, one of my goals in this shiur, because I'm skipping around a lot, is also to give you a sense of many of the major themes in Eicha, right? So we've talked a little bit about the theology of Eicha, the attempt to reconcile with the injustice that swirls around, along with a sense of God's justness. We talked a little bit about the alienation from God, right? Which is also part of the religious experience of contending with suffering. We talked a little bit about the sense of, enormity of the pain of Yerushalayim. It's like the chaotic sea. And now I want to talk about one of the major themes that we see in Eicha, particularly in Perek Aleph, and that is the loneliness of Yerushalayim. Of course, we know that that's how the book begins. Eicha yashva vadad ha'ir rabati am hayeta ke'almana Rabati vagoyim sarati bamedinot hayeta lamas, right? How has the city sat lonely? This city that was once so filled with people has become like a widow. This city that was once so great among nations is now a city sitting alone, okay? So, we see this really throughout Perek Aleph. There's almost an eerie feeling to the description of Yerushalayim. Sometimes when I read this Perek, I think, many years ago, when I went to college in the late 80s, I was in Stern College. I was in New York City, and every once in a while, I'd find myself early Sunday morning in a place like let's say the Times Square in New York City, because Stern College is right near there, and I don't know, 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and it's totally empty, right? A place that is known to be a place that is filled with the hustle and bustle of tens of and thousands of people that go through the city every day. And suddenly to be in that place when it's just empty of people, it feels so eerie. That's the description of Yerushalayim following the Chorban. Yerushalayim has become a lonely city. But what I want to draw your attention to from the perspective that we're approaching Megilat Eicha from is the importance of placement of words. Okay, now we talk about this a lot when we talk about biblical poetry, even when we talk about stories, even when we talk about narrative, we talk about words, right? The importance of words. The Midrashim talk about this a lot, the words that repeat themselves, and words that are placed in a very careful way in a composition. The word badad, the word alone, is a word that immediately comes to mind when we encounter Megilat Eicha, because it's pretty much the first important word. Eicha Yashva Vadad Ha'ira Bati'am. How has that city sat alone? And that loneliness of Yerushalayim, that's the first measure of her pain. It's the first glimpse of the enormity of her terrible experience. Now, I will say that unfortunately, this is something that the past 2 years has given us kind of new acquaintance with, right? I mean, so many of us were quarantined. So many of us spent that first Pesach Seder alone. In Hebrew, the word for quarantine was bidud, which is, of course, the word badad. And I think many of us know what a painful experience this is. But what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that this word doesn't just appear in the beginning of the book. It also appears in one other place in Megilat Eicha. And that is also in a very well-placed, well-positioned place. And that is in the middle chapter, right? Eicha is made up of 5 chapters. So we have a middle chapter. The middle chapter is divided, we're going to see this in a few minutes, into 3 parts. And so there's a middle part of the middle chapter. You following this? That middle part of the middle chapter is divided into 3 parts. You're just going to have to take my word for it for now, right? But we'll see in a minute. And the middle of the middle of the middle, Tov la gever ki yisa'o b'ne'urav. It is good for a person to bear a burden in his youth. Yeshev badad v'yidom ki natal alav. He should sit alone and be silent when it is placed upon him. I think one of the extraordinary things that I learned in Megilat Eicha is that when you get to the middle of the middle of the middle of the book of Lamentations, of the book that teaches us how to experience suffering within a religious context, you know what you find in the middle of the middle of the middle? You find Tov. you find the word good. That's not what I would have expected to find. I would have expected to find in the middle of the book of Eicha the word ra, the word bad, because suffering is bad. But that's not what Eicha tells us. Eicha tells us you can find good in this experience. You should sometimes sit alone. Loneliness can be strengthening. Loneliness can ultimately construct a person's persona, right? That's part of, I think, what we see here when we look at the word badad. It only appears twice in the entire book. In the beginning, to describe a very negative experience, and in the middle, to tell us that we can gain from this experience, that the experience doesn't have to be just negative. It can also be a constructive experience, one that can lead to good for the giver. So that's what I wanted to say about word placement. Maybe I'll show you one other example of, or maybe a couple other examples of word placement. Look for a moment at Eicha Perek Gimmel, the third chapter of Eicha. We mentioned before, it is the story of the Gever. Ani hagever ra'a oni b'shevet evrato. It is the middle chapter. It's the only chapter that talks about the experience of an individual. The 4 chapters that surround, right, 1 and 2 and 4 and 5, that surround this middle chapter are all talking about the experience of the nation, the collective experience, the national experience of crisis. The middle chapter talks about the individual. It is a very important chapter. It's a very useful chapter because, of course, it's not relating specifically to the events of 586 BCE. It's actually not relating at all to those events. It is relating to the experience of the individual who suffers, whatever that suffering is. And therefore, I think it's a really important chapter for every religious human, all of whom suffer at some point in our lives, right? That's part of the experience of being human, right? I can say this today. As I said before, it's my mother's 17th yahrzeit, right? We all experience at some point suffering. And I think that chapter 3 in Megilat Eicha is a useful tool to give us kind of religious blueprint or religious coping mechanisms for how to move. And when I say move, I mean move, right? Because the experience is meant to be a dynamic experience of movements. We're not meant to get stuck in any stage, but how to experience the movements of human suffering. What's interesting in what I brought for you here is the first word and the last word in chapter 3. The first word is the word ani. Ani hagever, ra'a oni. I am the person. I've seen my affliction, right? The beginning of suffering is very I-centered. I would use the word narcissistic, but I think that has a negative quality. And I don't mean this in a negative way at all. The beginning of suffering is a person turning inward and seeing the I. The end of suffering, according to Eicha Perek Gimmel, is to find God. The last word of Eicha Perek Gimmel is the word Hashem. It is the story of how the suffering individual moves forward in his attempt to find a relationship with God. And as I mentioned before, when we saw that image of God as the bear, as the lion who pounces, at the beginning of this chapter, the I feels very alienated from God. By the end of the chapter, not only has the I reconciled with God, but the I has found a stronger relationship with God. So looking at word placement is very important for understanding the ideas of the poetry, the ideas of Eicha. Okay, we'll skip this. We'll skip this as well. Let's just look at what time it is. Okay, we're going to have to start moving forward a little bit. I'll just mention another technique that we have in Megilat Eicha, and that is that some of you may have noted in your previous encounters with Megilat Eicha that there are different speakers that are used in Megilat Eicha. Sometimes it is the objective narrator that is describing Yerushalayim, that is describing the terrible events, the pain, the suffering. And sometimes Yerushalayim herself is speaking, okay? So, and sometimes I would even say right in the middle of a pasuk, right in the middle of a verse, the narrator switches very suddenly, very sharply. And that's the sort of thing that we are meant to pay attention to because it conveys some very important ideas. So let's look, for example, in Eicha, chapter 1, verse 2, which I brought for you here at the top of the screen, where the objective narrator is describing Yerushalayim crying. Bacho tivke balayla v'dimata alechia. She surely cries in the night, and her cheeks have tears on them. She has no comforter from all who loved her. So it's a very poignant description of Yerushalayim crying at night. Of course, this is the personification of the city. A city is an inanimate object. It, of course, does not cry. But this is, the way that that much of Tanakh regards Yerushalayim as almost a person, right? Later on in the same chapter, Yerushalayim is going to speak and describe her own tears. Look at what she says in chapter 1, verse 16. Al eile ani vochia, eini yor damayim, ki rachak mimeni menachem, meshiv nafshi. About these things I weep. My eyes, they flow with water, for far from me is a comforter, someone who may revive my spirit. I want to say as follows. There are two descriptions in chapter 1 of Yerushalayim crying. Which one is more powerful? Which one is more poignant? Which one moves us more? I would venture to say, we're not in the same room. I'm not actually seeing people and your responses, but I would venture to say that probably you would agree with me. It's the one where Yerushalayim describes herself. It's such a more powerful medium. About these things I cry, my eyes, they flow with water, for far from me is a comfort. Why use the medium of the objective narrator when Yerushalayim is such a more powerful medium? And actually, at this point, I'll just note that, really, chapter 1 is divided into two parts. The first part is the destruction or the description of Yerushalayim by the objective narrator. And the second part is Yerushalayim describes her own terrible situation. Why describe it twice? Why use two different speakers to describe basically the same thing? This really goes throughout the book, right? Because the book moves from one speaker to the other. And as I said, I think the speaker, the first person speaker, is so much more powerful. It lends itself to the question, why employ different speakers? And I want to offer as an answer the following midrash. The midrash says as follows. There are three types of sons. And by sons here, the midrash means prophets. One seeks the honor of both God and Am Yisrael. One wants to be the representative of God and the representative of the people. One wants to represent only God, but not the people. Who is that? That's Elijah. That's Eliyahu Navi. He doesn't want to be a representative of the people. They're fallible. They're filled with sin. They're filled with iniquity. He only wants to be a prophet that represents God. There's one type of prophet that wants to represent only only Am Yisrael, only the nation, and not God. Who is that? That is Jonah. That is the prophet Yonah, who when God gives him a prophecy of doom, he runs away, right? And the perfect prophet is the one that wants to represent both God and the people. Who is that? Whenever I ask the question, everyone always says, that's Moshe. Moshe's the perfect prophet. And of course, that's the correct answer. But that's not actually the answer in this Midrash. In this Midrash, the Midrash says, that is Yirmiyahu. And everybody says at this point, Yirmiyahu, if you read through the book of Jeremiah, all the time he says, I don't want to represent these people anymore. So what do you mean he's the perfect balanced prophet? Well, the Midrash brings a pasuk from our book, from Eicha. Why does Eicha use different speakers when it describes Jerusalem using the objective narrator? It does so from the perspective of God. It stands outside of Yerushalayim, judging Yerushalayim, keeping Yerushalayim a little bit at a distance. When it represents the story from the perspective of Jerusalem herself, it does so in order to represent the side of Am Yisrael. It's the perfect balance. Okay, so what I'm trying to show here, and is that these techniques, whether it's meter or imagery or word placement or the speaker, they all have deeper theological meaning. And we're meant to understand that form conveys meaning, that poetry is not just beautiful, it's not just aesthetically pleasing, but it is very deliberately shaped. It creates a certain kind of design, which is meant to convey meaning. Now, with this in mind, I want to turn our attention to structure. I want to talk about two different sorts of structure, but what I really want to talk about is the larger structure of Eicha, because as I said in the very beginning, those who understand the larger structure of Eicha, I think really understand the theology of Eicha. And that's not a small thing. I would say that is the main thing, right? What I'm interested in is what is the theology of suffering, right? What does God want us to experience when we do go through suffering, both as a nation and as individuals? Before we get there, I want to say something kind of brief about acrostics, alphabetic acrostics. I think many of you who have encountered Eicha every year have paid attention to the fact that Eicha is constructed as alphabetic acrostics, right? Chapter 1, the first pasuk starts with Aleph, the second with Bet, the third with Gimmel, etc., etc. The same is to be said in chapter 2. Chapter 3 is even more stunning. It has triple acrostics, Aleph, 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 Bet, Bet, Bet. I mean, that's really extraordinary. We only have that kind of phenomenon in one other place in all of Tanakh, and that is in Tehillim, chapter 119, where we have eightfold acrostics. I mean, that's really impressive. Chapter 4 is also written in acrostics, and chapter 5 is no longer written in acrostics, even though it contains 22 verses, which corresponds to the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So why do we have acrostics? So, for some rabbinic sources, the answer is it's a mnemonic, right? So that we should remember it by heart. There are lots and lots of compositions that are written as acrostics, right? Lots of piyutim, lots of poems, lots of zemirot, and lots of tefillot. And don't forget, we are very privileged that we all can be owners of a Siddur, of a Tanakh, of, many other books, right? But for maybe, thousands of years, it was prohibitively expensive. People didn't own a siddur. They had to know these things by heart. And so it shouldn't surprise us that something like Musaf of Shabbat, the main bracha, is written in backward acrostics as a mnemonic. I just brought you that as an example. But of course, a mnemonic is just a technicality. And I don't think that anything like this is really a technicality. And so I turn your attention to the Midrash on Eicha, which says that the reason that we have acrostics is because acrostics conveys the totality of suffering, the totality of destruction, because, of course, of the totality of sinfulness that led to this destruction. The very technical technique of using alphabetic acrostics to convey the Lamentations is a way of being able to convey a sense of the totality of grief without spending from today until next year describing the events of the destruction of Yerushalayim. So that's the first kind of structural point that I wanted to make. But the second structural point that I wanted to make relates to a different sort of structure that appears actually quite frequently in Tanakh. And that is something called a chiastic structure. A chiastic structure is named a chiastic structure based on the Greek letter chi, or chi, which is an X. It is an ABBA structure. The classic chiastic structure in Tanakh, just as an example, is a verse right after Noach comes out of the ark, which is built chiastically, shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. You can see it very clearly on the screen, ABC, CBA. To what end do we structure a verse like this? Well, this is a verse of, if you commit murder, you shall be killed. It's a verse of reward and punishment. You do A, you get A. You do B, you get B. Okay, that's a chiastic structure. And again, it is a technique, something that looks technical, but of course is designed to convey meaning. Well, in Eicha, we have chapter 1, which is built as a chiastic structure. I've brought it for you here on the screen in a color-coordinated way so that we could see this very easily and quickly. Look at how in the first verse we have the word rabati, and in the last verse we have the word rabot. In the second verse we have the words ein la menachem, and in the second to last verse, ein menachem li. In the third verse, we have the words bein hamitzarim, between the narrow straits. And in the third to last verse, kitzar li, I am very pained. Fourth verse, kohanim. Fourth to last verse, kohanim, right? I don't need to keep doing this. You can see it yourself on the screen, right? It is a very impressive chiastic structure, and it is designed to do two things. Number one, it gives you a sense that chapter 1 creates these concentric circles of grief, of pain, without any exit. There's no way out. In the beginning, there's no comforter. At the end, there's no comforter. In the beginning, the grief is terribly great. At the end, the grief is great. In the beginning, there's narrow places, and at the end, those same narrow places exist. It is a very, very kind of inescapable description of suffering. The other thing that we have, though, is the middle. Look at, I kind of skipped over some of the structure. Look in these middle two psukim, and look at what I've highlighted for you here. It's an internal chiastic structure. Do you see it? Re'ei Hashem v'habita, habitu or u, right? Re'eh, habita, habit, re'eh. You see, A, B, B, A. Right in the middle of the chapter, we have an inner structure. The inner structure conveys the essential idea of the chapter. What's the essential idea of the chapter? Yerushalayim is turning to God and saying, look, God, and see me. And God doesn't answer. And so Yerushalayim turns to the random passerby, kol ovrei derech, and says, look at me, see me. Nobody is looking at Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim in chapter 1 is the loneliest creature on earth. Okay, that's what is being conveyed here in the middle. We have a similar kind of structure in chapter 2, a similar kind of chiastic structure, where again, look at these two middle psukim, where again we have nishpach be'atef rechovot shafach. Do you see it? Right? The yellow is A, the blue is B, it's A, B, B, A. What is the middle of chapter 2? The middle of chapter 2 is describing the children who are dying on the streets of the city. That is the central image of chapter 2. If chapter 1 is about loneliness because God is not answering our call, because nobody is in Yerushalayim and nobody is looking at Yerushalayim, chapter 2 is about divine injustice. A city that witnesses the death of innocents, the children who are lying splayed in the streets. All right, these are just sort of techniques that I want to draw your attention to. And we're going to skip this. What I really want you to see, and this is what we're going to kind of begin to close up our shiur by seeing, is that Eicha as a whole has a chiastic structure. But by chiastic structure here, we could actually call it a concentric structure, because the middle has no match. It's not ABC, CBA, it's ABC, BA. So that chapter 1 is similar to chapter 5, chapter 2 is similar to chapter 4, and chapter 3 stands alone. And this, in my mind, is the most important understanding of the overall theology of Eicha. Because really, when we look at Eicha, we ask ourselves, what is our relationship with God in the book of Eicha? Do we regard God throughout our suffering as an ally or as an adversary? Do we regard ourselves as responsible for these events, or do we lay the blame at God, whose divine injustice causes the death of innocents? What's the attitude of Megilat Eicha to these enormous events? And I want to suggest that the attitude is actually very complex. In chapters 1 and 5, we have a lot of kind of very similar themes. These are very quiet chapters. They're lonely chapters. They're chapters that describe the emptiness of Yerushalayim, the desolation, the tears, the widows, those who have lost their husbands. Chapters 2 and 4 are very angry chapters. They're loud. They're angry. They're filled with destruction. Their primary image is fire. They describe the destruction of the leaders. These are chapters that are very similar, not just thematically, but also linguistically. Linguistically, in that there are words that appear only in chapters 1 and 5. There are lots of words that appear only in chapters 2 and 4. This is a way of drawing our attention to the similarity of these chapters, which create these two concentric circles and which draw our attention to the two different theological approaches in the book of Eicha. I brought this for you here. I know it's giving you a headache, but just to give you a sense of how similar chapters 1 and 5 are linguistically. Every word here that appears with a star is a word that appears only in these two chapters. Look at chapters 2 and 4. Again, these are very, I think, impressive linguistic similarities between these chapters. And what is it coming to show us? It's coming to draw our attention to a similar theology. The theology of chapters 1 and 5 is, indeed, life, these events have been terrible, but they are terrible because of my sins. Oy na lanu ki chatanu, woe to us, for we have sinned, it says here in Eicha 5. In Eicha 1, Tzadiku Hashem, kifihu mariti, God is just, for I have rebelled against him. That's the theology that is at the periphery of Megilat Eicha. But that's not the only theology in Megilat Eicha. In chapters 2 and 4, they have a totally different perception of how we understand God's role. The theology of chapters 2 and 4 is a theology of confusion, of bewilderment, of not understanding God. Remember, we said that the center of chapter 2 are the children who are dying on the streets of the city. You killed on the day of your anger, God. You slaughtered without pity. This, I think, is the very complex experience of theology in the book of Eicha. On the one hand, we have chapters 1 and 5, which advocate a very strong reliance on simple faith, on what we call emuna pshuta, a simple faith, a belief that there must be meaning, that this must be justified, that tzadiku Hashem, that God is just. Only in these circumstances can we exist in this world. Without this type of faith, the world is dark and absurd, it's incomprehensible, and we can't live in it. On the other hand, Eicha does not, I think, thankfully, resort to simple formula, to easy, facile answers, to platitudes in the face of the preeminent theological question of suffering. Eicha offers us also, I think, an honest view of a world in which human beings can't always understand God's ways. And that's chapters 2 and 4. And that reflects, I think, the very kind of complex theological approach of Eicha. Chapters 1 and 5 give us a buffer, a periphery, but sometimes when we dig deeper, we encounter a world that doesn't sit well with us. This is the chiastic structure that gives us this very complex and kind of oscillating experience of these two poles. We go back and forth between pure faith in a good world that is based on our belief in a good God and a burning, unremitting outrage over the incomprehensibility of the way that the world around us works. This is Eicha. I think it makes an incredibly important contribution to the complexity of human existence. And only if you, I think, take that step back and see the bird's eye view, can you see it. But I don't want to leave us on a dark note. I want to kind of end by drawing our attention rather briefly to the middle chapter, the one that is really the center of the book, the center of the concentric structure, and the center of the way in which we are contending with theology, but especially the theology of the individual. Remember, we said that Eicha chapter 3 is featuring the individual sufferer. Now, I mentioned before that this book should be divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is where the Gever describes his suffering, right, and his alienation from God. Part 3, the Gever goes back to describe his suffering. He's no longer alienated from God, but that's a different story, okay? Because what I really want to look at now in the last 2 minutes is part 2. The middle of the book of Eicha is the only part of Eicha where we have an actual kind of developed, somewhat developed theological reflection. As I said, the book of Eicha is not a book of theology, but right there at the center, we have theology. And this theology is also divided into 3 parts. The first part, as we might expect, is the theology of the ways of God. And the conclusion is God is filled with chesed. God is filled with rachamim. God is filled with kindness and loyalty. The third part of these theological reflections return to the ways of God and come to these very same conclusions, chesed and rachamim. But of course, what is most interesting, and I alluded to it before, but I want to close with it today, is what we find at the contemplative center of the book of Eicha, which I believe mirrors the contemplative center of every human being, what lies at the core of every human being, the secret of human resilience. What we find at the center of Eicha is what every human being contains at his own core, and at the core of human experience lies not God, but humans. We don't find God in the center. What human beings find in the center of their experience of contending with suffering is their own resilience, their own courage, their own conviction, which is buffered by their faith in God. But it's a conviction in good. It's a belief in good. As I said before, the most remarkable thing that I felt that I discovered in my study of the book of Eicha is that the middle of the book is Tov LaGever. It is good to be human. That's a paraphrase a bit, but it is good to be human, and we find goodness. God's ways are good. God's ways are eternal. They renew themselves daily, even if we don't always comprehend them, even if sometimes they leave us with a sense of pain, of incomprehension. We remain with the core ability to find hope, to find belief in God. And at the core of the book, we have this kernel of faith that the world that God gave us is good, because that's how the Tanakh starts. God creates a world, Vayar Hashem ki tov me'od. It is a good world. And even with all of the difficulty of human being, and Eicha is not sugarcoating it, right? Eicha records the grim reality of painful, unremitting suffering of being a human, but also gives us the opportunity to witness and to experience that at the core of the book sustains a deep, abiding faith in the human ability to find good, in human ability, in humans' extraordinary resilience, and the marvel of our own continued unconditional fidelity to God and belief in the good of being human. I thank you for your patience, and I'm open to taking questions. I'm happy if you want to unmute yourselves. I know it's been a little long, and I apologize for going over a little bit, but I'm happy to take questions or comments if anybody has.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do you think that the Geber undergoes personal growth through the suffering, and is that one of the messages that we're supposed to take for our own suffering experiences as well from Eicha?
Oh, so who is speaking? Because I can't see you. So just what's your name?
This is Marcus speaking.
Oh, okay. Now I do see you. I just didn't see that you were talking.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The Gever goes through an unbelievable process of growth. I didn't have time to do that. I actually thought about maybe just teaching Perek Gimmel, because that is an extraordinary story in its own right. What is the nature of the growth that the Gever undergoes is a really important question, because of course there is something circular about the chapter. He returns to the suffering, but he returns after his theological reflections a changed person. And I would say there are two very, very remarkable changes that I'll mention now. One is that, as I said, he's no longer alienated from God. He sees God as being at least potentially on his side, someone who he can turn to both in prayer and for assistance. And the other, I think, even more remarkable change that he undergoes is that he's no longer alienated from his community. Right at the beginning of Perek Gimmel, he describes his sense of alienation from his community. Right, he says in Pasuk Yudal, "Haiti schok lechol ami nigilatam kol hayom." I was a laughing stock for my people. But as soon as he emerges from the theological reflections, he becomes an advocate of his people, and he starts speaking instead of in first person singular. He right away starts speaking in first person plural. Right, nachbesad drachenu v'nachkora v'nashuva el Hashem. So I think the first thing that he gains from his theological reflections is his understanding that through his suffering, he can help others. He can be a better, more useful part of the community, which is, I think, a remarkable way to kind of heal from suffering, is not by asking how I personally have changed, but how my change can contribute to the world at large and to my community in particular, and even more particular to the community of sufferers and to those who are looking to use that suffering to solidify and strengthen their relationship with God. So it's a very good question that you asked. I don't have all the time in the world to answer it properly, but that would be the sort of brief answer that I would give. I see a couple hands up. You want to just unmute yourselves and ask the question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the insights, David speaking. A comment rather than a question, or maybe I can turn it into a question, which is that your initial thoughts on meter I found quite fascinating. Wasn't something I'd noticed before. And it started me thinking whether readers of Eicha actually do justice to this, because it's all too easy to fall into the 3-3 of Ha'azino and then add extra syllables which aren't there to make it sound the same as everything else does. I know certainly if I'm asked to read Eicha this year, I'm going to be paying far more attention to make sure I do justice to the meter. So if I turn it into a question, in your experience, do you think that readers of Eicha that you've heard really do justice to this, or do we accidentally destroy it by trying to be more exact to what we think the music of Eicha ought to be?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I'm a little spoiled because I live in Alon Shvut, and we have really an array of really very precise readers. And if they don't read precisely, they get walloped. So it's, so that's there's a positive and a negative to that. But I imagine that you're right, that there's kind of a tendency to make things feel more comfortable. And the meter is deliberately uncomfortable. I will say one thing that your comment kind of made me think about, and that is that, as I said before, most people didn't have a Sidur for many years. And so most of us were not biblical readers. We were biblical listeners, right? So the experience of listening is a more primary experience than the experience of reading, actually. So that's I agree with you. I think, and I'd love to come hear you also this year. I'm a little far, but the experience of carefully expressing not just the words, but the way that the words are supposed to impact us, right, is a critical element of the experience of Eicha.
No, I agree with that in general. Look, I'm a Balkara and I try very hard, and I think people who've heard me will attest that I'm actually reading a story. I'm not just reciting verses, and the people actually get the drift of the meaning. This week is my Bar Mitzvah Parashiot, so here we're reading Matot and Maseh. So I am reading it this year, sadly not in Hamayan, but elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay. Mazal tov, happy birthday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ziegler. An amazing insight into the textual analysis of such a powerful book. But I can't help but put Eicha together with Eov, with Job, the two books that deal with suffering. And you use the phrase, of course, that both books deal with, God's will is not understandable by us, and we must come to terms with it ourselves. What I wanted to understand is, and I'm not an expert, so I know, please correct, but if I understand Eov, the structure is more linear, and it takes us through the story of his suffering as it gets more and more and more. And then the realization comes at the end, and he comes to the realization of that he is alone and hope is there and the world is good. But in the way you've described Eicha, I don't get that sense of hope. Your structure is it's quietly suffering, then it's loudly suffering. Then we get to the hope in chapter 3, and then we go back into 4, which is loud, and 5 into quiet. So it's not linear, it's very, very oppressive. So you finish your talk, and we certainly felt here uplifted by it, but I don't get a sense from the structure. So how does that work?
That's a really, really, really wonderful observation. So I'll say one thing about Eov, and then I'll explain what I think is going on in Eicha. Eov is a book of philosophy. It's a book of theology, and it's directly contending with the question of suffering. Now, when I first started working with Eicha, I turned my attention to Eov to find the similarities, and there are some similarities, but there are not that many. There are some linguistic similarities, particularly, I would say, when the Gever in chapter 3 describes his suffering. There is a lot of overlap with some of the descriptions in Eicha and Perek Tet Zayin and Perek Yud Tet. But mostly, Eicha is not about the theology of suffering, even though that's what I presented at the end. It's about the experience of suffering. And that's very different. And that, I think, accounts for your excellent observation, which is that it's oppressive. But the way I see Eicha is that it mirrors the human being experience, the structure. That what's happening is that what swirls around the human being is the experience of suffering. The outer layer is the sort of basic belief that God buffers us, that it must be okay. The inner layer is it doesn't feel so okay, right? And the most internal experience is that we scratch at the very deepest core of our humanness to find our human resilience. That's the way I picture it. I don't know if that's what was intended here, but that's the way I see it. It certainly is what I'm saying about the difference between Eicha and Eov, that I would definitely sign off on. In other words, it's a difference between a cognitive kind of experience and an experiential description. And I will say one more thing about Eicha, and that is that Eicha is not an easy book, and it's an unrelieved suffering. You know, we like to think that Eicha ends with the words Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekeder, because that's what we force the Baal Koreh to say in shul at the end. But that's not the end, right? The real end of Eicha is Ki im ma'os me'astanu katzafta aleinu ad me'od. You have surely rejected us, God. You have been excessively wrathful in us. Eicha is a book that lacks comfort. The word nechama appears 6 times in the book of Eicha, every single time in the negative. Ein menachem li, right? It's not a book of consolation. It's not a book that is trying to take us out of the experience. And I think that's also to the credit of Tanakh. Tanakh allows us an experience of suffering because that is so common to the human experience, and Tanakh is a book that is reflecting human experiences. What relieves the book of Eicha is not Eicha itself, but, and look, I mean, you know, one of the most frequently asked questions that I got when working on Eicha, and it took me about 5 years to write the book. By nature, I have a very, I think, optimistic personality. And people would often say to me, you know, but how could you be working with Eicha for all this time? It's such a depressing book. And what I answered, and what is the true answer, is that the relief for Megilat Eicha is seeing Eicha within the broader context of Tanakh. Eicha is not in a vacuum. It is met by all of the books of Shivat Zion. It's not the end of the story. And when you begin to see the linguistic reversals of the book of Eicha in all of the Shivat Zion books, it's tremendously hopeful. It shows you that Eicha is a blip. It's an important blip, but, you know, and it's not a blip that we'll ever forget. It's one that we grow from, and it's one that it leaves a deep imprint on our soul as a nation, as individuals, as does all suffering and death. But it also is a blip that we can recover from. And that's part of, I think, seeing Eicha in its broader context. That's another shiur that I very much like to give, which is how the Sheva Dinechemta, the 7 chapters that we read between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah, which are all chapters that are describing Shivat Zion in the end of Sefer Yeshayahu, how they reverse Eicha linguistically. It's remarkable. So that's kind of the relief for Eicha. But internally, Eicha is not a book that is giving us a lot of relief. As it teaches us that in our innermost being, we can find Tov, but it's not really about relief. And so your observation, I would completely agree with.
I think I just heard you offer a shiur, Lydia. I think we need to book that before Rosh Hashanah to get the 7 chapters. Done. Thank you.
You can tempt me because it is really one of my favorite shiurim, because it's just so beautiful the way that I think both the Tanakh works and the way Chazal allow it to be part of our yearly experience. It's just remarkable.
I'm convinced. Let's book it. Let's do it.